travelling south on the road to Rafah. The unmistakable red and blue flashes of emergency vehicles driving in convoy towards Gazans in need. En route, they see another ambulance that appears to have veered off the road. Their vehicles and high-vis uniform clearly marked with the emblem of the Red Crescent. Little did they know that they themselves are about to become the victims.
We're now learning more about the horrifying attack by the IDF against 15 aid workers in Gaza who were killed. Now, in the video that we just showed you, you could see that the aid workers were obviously aid workers. You can see the ambulance trucks with their bright flashing lights. But nonetheless, through an investigation that's been reported by Haaretz, we have learned that the IDF was very much behind this attack, and more importantly, they are, lying about, their involvement for one. But any claim that this was a mistake or an accident, I think, has been dispelled by this investigation. So let's get to the details. Before we get into what this investigation uncovered, which, by the way, includes gunshots at point blank range and a mass grave, here's an overview of what happened that night when 15 aid workers were killed in Gaza.
The video of apparent relentless Israeli fire continues for 5 minutes as the paramedic filming prays for mercy.
يما سامحيني يما هذه هي الطريقة اللي اخترتها يما إني أساعد الناس سامحيني يما.
For nearly 2 weeks, Israel has denied the apparent reality, claiming they opened fire on suspicious vehicles advancing towards them without headlights or emergency signals. The footage appears to directly contradict their version of events. It was discovered on a phone buried with the paramedic in a shallow mass grave, along with 14 of his colleagues and their vehicles. The Palestine Red Crescent Society said he'd been shot in the head.
This devastating incident represents the single most deadly attack on Red Cross Red Crescent workers anywhere in the world since 2017. These dedicated ambulance workers were responding to wounded people. They were humanitarians. They wore emblems that should have been protected. Their ambulances were clearly marked and they should have returned to the families. They did not.
I would really appreciate if public figures, so-called intellectuals like Douglas Murray, were actually forced to contend with details of stories like the one that we're talking about right now, instead of diverting a debate into a ridiculous discussion about whether or not someone is able to comment on stuff like this when they're not an expert or when they've never been there with a Israeli escort showing them the way, leading the way. We're gonna get to Douglas Murray later on in the show. Okay, so let's hold off on that. But for now, a summary of the IDF's probe into the incident was published last week, and they lied, which shouldn't be surprising because they lie all the time. The IDF General Staff investigation found that in 3 separate incidents, the force mistakenly fired on ambulances and a UN vehicle, frequently deviating from orders. The public summary of the investigation rejected claims that the workers were bound and executed and stated that the forces did not fire indiscriminately. Now, that last line, I want you to take it in because that's the biggest lie, that the IDF did not fire indiscriminately. They did. So this expose was done by Israeli newspaper Haaretz, as I mentioned earlier, and it revealed that it was much worse than what the IDF was admitting to. Here's what actually happened. On the night of March 23rd and into the 24th, the IDF was actually preparing for a surprise assault on the Tel al-Sultan district of Rafah. Okay, so that's on the southern end of the Rafah Strip, where they suspected Hamas militants were reorganizing after the brief ceasefire. So the Sararet Golani unit of the IDF was tasked with carrying out this ambush, and around 2 a.m., 2 in the morning, they set up along the route expected to be used by Palestinians evacuating toward Khan Yunis and al-Mawasi. Okay, so the route where the Israeli force positioned itself that night was one where travel was permitted for rescue personnel and civilians at the time. Therefore, the aid and medical workers using it were not required to request special permission, contrary to the IDF's initial statement following the incident. Following the slaughter, let's be clear. That statement was later found to be based on incorrect information provided by the forces in the field. So then at around 3:30 a.m., another IDF unit reported over the radio that there was increased ambulance movement on the route. Increased ambulance. Okay, so they're even identifying these are aid workers. Okay, these are ambulance trucks or vans. In other words, the soldiers knew to expect ambulances driving past them on this route that they were using to do this ambush, right? So at 3:57 a.m., an ambulance with flashing lights passed through the area on a routine trip. The occupants could not see the hidden troops. Positioned on higher ground, the troops were not under threat of a ramming attack and had been ordered not to reveal themselves before the main offensive on Tel al-Sultan. Nonetheless, the deputy commander instructed the entire force to prepare to fire on the ambulance. That was the order. And as the ambulance was about to pass by, the soldiers did just that. They start firing at the ambulance. They charged toward the vehicle while shooting, killing 2 aid workers and detaining another person. So the soldiers turned off the ambulance and its lights, concealed the bodies, and returned to their original position. But it's not over yet. There's more. It gets worse. At 5:06 a.m., a convoy of rescue workers, including ambulances and fire trucks, traveled along the route. All the vehicles had their lights on and flashing. And as you can see in the recovered video, it was dark out. Now, usually when it's dark, it's difficult to see, but you know what? What's not hard to see when it's dark? An ambulance truck with flashing lights. You can see it clearly. You can identify it. We all know what that looks like. The IDF knows what that looks like. You're seeing it with your own 2 eyes right now as we speak, if you're watching the video version of the show. So the convoy stopped near the attacked vehicle, and medical teams disembarked to move towards the bodies. The medical personnel wore fluorescent vests and kept their identification lights on along with the sirens to make their presence clear, fearing they might be targeted by the IDF. So let's just pause for a second. I understand their reasoning. Let's make it abundantly clear we're aid workers so the IDF doesn't mistake us for Hamas militants and we won't, be a target. Except how many stories have we shared with you all on this show, as reported by Israeli sources, by the way, Haaretz is an Israeli source, in which ambulance workers, humanitarian aid workers were intentionally targeted by the IDF? How many times have we shared stories like that? So think about how insanely brave one must have to be in order to work as an aid worker, as someone who's willing to deliver humanitarian aid. Think about the balls it takes to do that in the Gaza Strip, knowing full well the IDF can just attack you, kill you, bury you in a shallow grave. And then if anyone asks any questions about it, they can just deny it. And then after there's an investigation, they'll be like, oh yeah, oops. Maybe one person will be let go from the military, from the IDF, but that's it. And then the vicious cycle happens all over again and again and again and again. And when we're talking about the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, they're trapped. This is an asymmetrical war being waged on a group of people in a tiny strip of land in which they have no escape route, they have nowhere to go, they have no real military protecting them. I mean, just think about that. Israel right now is being supported by the top military superpower in the world, the United States, with heavy weaponry, with 2,000-pound bombs. You think Hamas has 2,000-pound bombs? It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. This is not about rooting out Hamas. As the convoy stopped, the deputy battalion commander ordered the force to open fire on the vehicles. So remember, there's the first attack. Then an ambulance shows up and tries to provide aid to, the bodies that they see. And then those workers, those responders end up getting attacked as well. Haaretz reports that the distance between the convoy and the soldiers was just between 20 and 30 meters. So it's not like they were off at a distance and it was difficult to decipher, are these enemies or are these, ambulance workers or humanitarian aid workers? No, it was very clear. So the soldiers reached the aid team within seconds and fired continuously for approximately 3.5 minutes. And it gets even worse if you can believe it. The soldiers reloaded their magazines and kept shooting even after it was clear that no return fire was coming from the other side. And despite the cries of the aid workers who tried to identify themselves, thinking that maybe identifying ourselves would, lead to some mercy from the IDF, but the IDF knew who they were. So some of the aid workers attempted to flee, but by the end of the 3.5 minutes, 12 of them had been killed. And incredibly, the soldiers still weren't done killing people. About 12 minutes after the previous assault ended, a UN vehicle with an UNRWA worker arrived. The vehicle approached with its lights on, seemingly attempting to signal its presence to the IDF force at the scene. The UN worker did not leave the vehicle or approach the soldiers, but the deputy battalion commander decided to fire at the vehicle. Joined by one of the soldiers, they killed the UN worker. I mean, when you hear the far-right government of Israel or members within that government literally refer to humanitarian aid workers with the UN as terrorists, as members of Hamas, you think they're making those statements by accident? Or could it be that they do that intentionally to dehumanize humanitarian aid workers, to dehumanize anyone associated with the United Nations? Because the Israeli government despises the UN. Let's be clear about that. Why do they despise the UN? Because sometimes the UN will have member countries speak out against the way Israel's prosecuting this war in Gaza. And we know how Israel reacts to anyone who's critical of their actions in Gaza. We've seen it happen here in the United States. The UN knows what kind of treatment they'll get as well. The UN knows the way their humanitarian aid workers will be treated if they're trying to provide relief to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So the brigade commander instructed the unit to hide all the dead bodies in the ground and to bury and crush the ambulances. The following morning, they gave international organizations the location of where the bodies had been hidden so they could retrieve them. Of course, the IDF unit responsible for the killings claimed that they thought they were in danger. Right. Despite the fact that the ambulance workers likely hadn't even seen them, considering their positioning. Remember, they were positioned to do an ambush. So the ambulance workers had no idea they were there. The IDF's investigation determined after the fact that 6 of the 15 killed workers were Hamas members, but whatever evidence they have for that is unclear. And I'm gonna go ahead and make a bold prediction and say they don't have any. Now, following the incident, the deputy battalion commander who led the attack was dismissed from the IDF for professional failures. He should be in prison for the rest of his life. Okay, he is responsible for the slaughter of innocent people. He should be in prison for the rest of his life. He robbed innocent people of their lives. And I know that this happens every day in Gaza to the point where a lot of people are just desensitized to it at this point. But at what point are we gonna get any justice for the innocent lives that have been slaughtered by members of the IDF? This wasn't just simply a professional failure. This was an intentional slaughter. While the Israeli military stated that it regrets the harm caused to uninvolved civilians, it argued its soldiers were conducting a vital mission targeting Hamas terrorists and reiterated the claim that Hamas uses medical and humanitarian infrastructure for terrorism, including using ambulances to transport terrorists and weapons. That's complete and utter BS, and we all know it. We all know it. They didn't kill any Hamas members. I mean, just think about it in our own context. Seriously. If a local police force decided to, for 3.5 minutes, indiscriminately shoot at an ambulance truck, and then the first responders who come to save individuals from that ambulance truck, if those cops told us, well, we suspected, those ambulance trucks were full of MS-13 gang members. I mean, we didn't ask any questions. We just started shooting, and then we reloaded and kept shooting. And then more people came and we killed them too. Would we buy that argument? Would we buy that argument? Okay, for the right wingers out there, if the cops had done that to a car carrying a family of sovereign citizens, okay, they might believe in that ideology, but there's no evidence that they've done anything wrong. They're not harming anybody, but the cops just decide to open fire, shoot at them anyway, and kill them. Would we be okay? Would you accept the argument that, well, the police suspected that these sovereign citizens might have caused some harm in the future? You wouldn't buy that argument because that's unjust. That type of injustice is not accepted in any other context, except when Israel carries it out for whatever reason. And it's because for decades, our media has conditioned Americans to be good little boys and girls who accept the depravity of the Israeli government. But let's keep it real. Killing aid workers like this brazenly and really not suffering any real consequences for it is pretty disgusting. But we'll keep funneling our precious resources, tax dollars, and weapons to the Israeli government, to the IDF, so they can continue the slaughter. So they finally grab hold of the Gaza Strip, take control of that land, and get what they've always wanted to begin with. The Hamas attack was the perfect excuse, okay, for Israel to finally do what it's always wanted to do. By the way, just a day later, or a day after this report was published, Israel is also admitting that the Israeli tank fire was responsible for a deadly strike on a United Nations guest house in the Gaza Strip. This happened last month. That attack ended up killing a Bulgarian aid worker and badly injured 5 international staffers. I'm sure that was an accident. Yeah. Until now, by the way, the IDF repeatedly denied involvement in the attack, but smart people, meaning anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together, knew what the reality was.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.